Hey there. Welcome to Growing Up in Charlestown, Moving On Up. This story is about moving from the projects, public housing, to my grandmother's house in another section of Charlestown. So we were a family of eight kids plus two parents living in what I believe was a three-bedroom apartment in the projects, Bunker Hill Housing Projects, public housing. Um, in Charlestown. So my grandmother, so this was about 1970. My grandmother was living on Chestnut Street in Charlestown, which is about a 10-minute walk from where we lived in the projects. Now, my grandmother was referred to as Nana. I don't really remember her that well because I was just a little kid when she passed away. And I vaguely remember sort of a chubbyish woman with white hair. One of my older sisters said she was very nice to us all the time. And as I said, I don't really remember her that much. I did do some research later using Ancestry and found out that she had come here from Ireland in 1920. She was only 18 years old. A couple years later, met who would become my grandfather. He also had emigrated from Ireland in about 1915. But by the time I was born, my grandfather had already passed away. Nana was running the house on Chestnut Street as a boarding house. And that was pretty common in Charlestown back in the 60s and into the early 70s because the Boston Naval Shipyard was located in Charlestown. It still is, but it's closed down. It's now, like much of Charlestown, all condominiums. And the so she ran the house as a boarding house. Several, tenants had different rooms. There was a different setup. There were like three rooms for rent on the first floor. Second floor, there were two individual rooms for rent. Each one had a little kitchenette, and there was a shared bath, not even a bathroom, a water closet, essentially a toilet in a tiny room in the hall. But in any case, although her house was close and only 10 minutes away, it literally seemed like it was a different world than the projects. There were no courtyards full of screaming kids, no mothers sitting outside with their baby carriages, smoking their Winston cigarettes. And Chestnut Street actually had trees and gas lights. And it was a big three-story brick townhouse. And I do remember going to visit a couple of times, and it was literally so quiet that my ears would ring. I guess now you kind of call it tinnitus, but back then it was so quiet in the house that my ears would ring. I literally was not used to that quiet. I mean, we lived underneath the Tobin Bridge where you heard cars going by constantly, you know, big families, kids out in the courtyard screaming and playing all the time. And so it was about 1970 or so. My grandmother had died, and her husband, her I think second husband, had signed the house over to my dad, and so we moved in. And when we moved into the house, it was still a boarding house. The Navy Yard was open. It was still a boarding house, and we had on the second floor there was a kitchen, there was a dining room, there was a living room, which in Boston, maybe New England, we call the parlor, and a bedroom and another small sort of side room. So as I mentioned, we're a big family. So my parents had the bedroom with my youngest brother who was in a crib. Then we had five boys in the parlor, two sets of bunk beds and a cot. And then the other small room, which probably would make a decent walk-in closet, was where my two sisters slept. I did some research years later, found out the house was built in 1865 by a shoe merchant who lived in the north end of Boston. And so, we moved in there early 1970s. 1973, the Navy Yard shut down. and Charlestown literally became a ghost town. I think all of the tenants who were in our house moved out, except for one guy who stayed there pretty much the rest of his life. And once the Navy Yard closed, like I said, Charlestown was like a ghost town. Anyone who was renting an apartment, they moved, right? They moved to go follow the work. A lot of people moved up to New Hampshire at that time. And even on our street, there were many empty houses with broken windows and whatnot, based on the fact that the Navy Yard had closed. It would be like the Ford factory closing down in Detroit. I think there were probably 20,000 people working there at that time. But in any case, so we made that big move from the projects, moving on up to Chestnut Street in Charlestown, and stayed in that house. I think it was about for 50 years before my mother eventually sold the house. And she sold the house for, I think, $1.6 million. And right now, that house is two condo units, and each one is worth about $2 million. So it's just amazing how the value of property has gone up, and it's gone up to such an extent that most of the people who have grown up in Charlestown can literally no longer afford to live here. Anyway, so that's the story of moving on up from the projects to Chestnut Street in Charlestown.